The date is April 17, 1942. The RAF rear party, under the command of my grandfather, Flight Lieutenant Brian Rofe, has been trapped behind lines for 57 days. The members of the party are strewn across a beach on the northwest coast of Dutch Timor, near the village of Tuakau. Shortly after making contact with an American submarine, the USS Searaven, lights from 2 Japanese patrols can be seen converging on the party's position from different ends of the beach. Both patrols are expected to arrive at Tuakau sometime the following day. A decision is made to evacuate half the party, an endeavour that will require 16 malaria-stricken airmen to swim through a large surf in the dead of night to a wooden wherry sitting out beyond the waves. Brian selects the fittest men to make the swim and remains on the beach with men so sick most can barely stand. The last man he selects to swim through the surf that night is leading aircraftman Len Burke.
Right, so I was the last one picked on the first night. The rest were doomed.
I'm Tom Trumbull, and this is Trapped.
Men and women of Australia.
Australia, you are the sons and daughters.
The story of one of the greatest escapes of the Pacific War.
Japanese naval and air forces launched an unprovoked attack. A state of war exists between Australia and Japan.
To work in the defence of Australia.
Chapter 6. The Longest Day.
Orang Jepang tiba sebelum hari gelap. Mereka akan
Mid-afternoon on April the 18th, 1942, on the beach at Tuakau. The chief of the village tells Brian that the Japanese patrol coming from the southern end of the beach will arrive before nightfall, a few hours away. The chief recommends hiding in the hills. Brian shakes his head. 2 of his men are delirious and 1 is a breathing skeleton. Hiking back into the hills will kill them. Another week on Timor and 8 will be dead. Besides, they no longer had a radio to contact Darwin and arrange another rescue. Tonight, they escape or they die. The chief gives Brian 2 turtle eggs and then takes his people into the jungle. For the rest of the day, Brian, his good friend, Hudson pilot, Flight Lieutenant Harold Cookie Cook, and Cookie's co-pilot, Pilot Officer Vivian Leithhead, keep watch. The other men are strewn out under the jungle canopy, hidden from the view of enemy reconnaissance aircraft. Shortly before dusk, Brian lights a fire to boil the turtle eggs and some rice. He offers the 3 sickest men the eggs, but they've all gone off their food. Brian checks the condition of the others and concludes that leading aircraftman Clyde Pappen looks in the worst shape.
Brian said, I'm going to get you a couple of eggs. I said, where are you going to get a couple of eggs? He said, turtle eggs. And he gave me 2 eggs and they were delicious. I bet. Turtle eggs. And immediately I felt better. Just wanted the nourishment. He wouldn't leave us. He stayed behind. He didn't have to, but he did. He got everyone on board before he was a good leader, no doubt about that.
After dinner, Brian douses the fire. With Cookie and Leithhead's help, he digs a large hole. They throw in clothing, boots, empty knapsacks, firearms and kerosene tins before covering it all up. Brian doesn't want to leave anything at all to the enemy. Aside from the tattered clothes in which he stood, Brian retains a cigarette case. He opens up the case and slips inside a letter demanding his surrender, sent from the Japanese and handed to him the previous day by a Timorese courier. The only thing left is the bag of money. Flying Officer Arthur Cole took 3,000 guilders out to the submarine the night before. Brian calculates he has about 800 guilders worth of coins. He'd intended on giving the money to George, his Timorese guide from Kapsali, but George's disappearance the night before had put paid to those plans. Brian leaves the money bag at the base of a tree. If the chief of Tuakau or one of these people return, he'll give it to them. Otherwise, Brian will hurl it into the sea before they go. At sunset, those that are strong enough stand up and cautiously walk out onto the beach. Every eye looks south to where torchlights of the patrol had been seen the night before. All they could see was a light blinking from the Cape, at least 16 kilometres away.
Keep your voices down.
Cookie hushes their cheers, fearful that unfriendly ears further inland would hear their celebrations. But Brian says nothing. He looks out to sea beyond the large surf. He sees something that only a man trained in meteorology would spot, something unsettling. There are no stars on the horizon. That night, Lieutenant Commander Hiram Cassidy, captain of the USS Searaven, decides to add a crewman to the wherry. A hefty chief machinist's mate, Chief Petty Officer John Lorenz, would join Ensign George Cook, Petty Officer Swede Markison, and Petty Officer Joe McGreevy. Lorenz will stay in the boat while the other three swim to the beach. At 7 o'clock, 2 hours before rendezvous, Searaven surfaces.
Surfaced and observed air raid on Kopang. This one seemed to be about twice the size of last night's raid.
Cassidy sees something else. Japanese torches blinking near the two mountain peaks towards the interior. The Japanese are now converging on Tuakau from a third point, but the patrol in the south is in more or less the same position as the previous night. Something or someone has stalled the Japanese. A storm approaches. It's anyone's guess as to when it will arrive. At 9 o'clock, Cassidy trains his binoculars towards the beach. The 30-second torch signal is seen. Cassidy tells his signalman on the blinker gun to flash SR, SR in acknowledgement, and then orders the launching of the wherry. 500 metres off the coast, the swell begins to noticeably rise and fall. It's bigger than the previous night. Ensign Cook's eyes are focused shoreward. He can see the lights in the jungle drawing closer to the rendezvous point. To Cook, it looks like they are within a few kilometres of the beach. Once the boat's in position, the anchor is lowered. McGreevy and Cook flash their torches towards the beach and immediately receive the signal. McGreevy, Markison and Cook all dive into the heaving sea. Lorenz watches on as the long lines run out over the gunwale. The waves are huge, at least 15 feet. The three men are all swallowed up in the surf. Violently turned and twisted, the Americans are dumped on the beach, shocked at the power of the surf. Panting and exhausted, they look back. The peaks of the waves hide the wherry from view. Markison leads them to the airmen. Cook and McGreevy each trail a long line with 5 life jackets attached.
Thank you for coming back, Ensign Cook. We owe you.
Wouldn't have missed it for the world.
Joe McGreevy is appalled at the sight of the half-dead men huddled together on the beach.
They were a miserable-looking group, in much poorer shape than the first group.
A lightning strike illuminates the beach. Ensign Cook pulls out 3 rolls of bandages from a pouch attached to his waist and hands one each to McGreevy and Markison. The 3 sickest men are lifted out of the stretchers. They each have their wrists tied together with a bandage. Their bound arms are then looped around the neck of one of the submariners. McGreevy carries 21-year-old aircraftman Phil Keane. They wade in. Waist deep, McGreevy sees a large wave approaching. The bandages bite into McGreevy's neck as he fights his way through the breakers. Once they enter deeper water, the bandages start to cut off McGreevy's air supply. Wheezing and turning red, McGreevy ducks under the last wave, hauling himself along the line towards the wherry. Lorenz reaches over and pulls Phil off McGreevy's shoulders and lays him down in the bilge area. With deep red marks across his throat, McGreevy hauls himself aboard. Markison and Cook arrive, struggling to keep the barely conscious Australians from dragging them under. Eventually, they make it to the wherry. All 3 rescuers crumple on the bottom of the boat alongside their distressed passengers and suck in lungfuls of air. Lorenz stands over them at the stern of the boat. The worst of it is over. With Cookie and Brian's help, the remaining airmen can now be taken out in one go. The 3 Americans are preparing to return to the beach when the storm arrives. A wind gust pushes the wherry into the surf. The anchor digs into the sand, bringing the wherry broadside to the waves. Cook and McGreevy grab an oar and begin backpaddling, but the wind is too strong. The anchor slips. Water pours over the gunwales, drenching the three barely conscious Australians. Cook and McGreevy desperately try to turn the boat with their oars so that they are facing forward, but the surf is too powerful. The wherry capsizes and washes onto the beach, upside down. Brian, Leithhead and Cookie run over. They help the Americans turn the boat upright. The three Australians are miraculously still alive. They are placed back in the bottom of the boat. Brian decides to add more ballast to the boat. He runs back to the beach and selects 4 men. They stagger to the boat and clamber aboard. Each man is handed a paddle. The 3 sickest men have already been helped aboard and are placed in the bottom of the boat. McGreevy looks to the heavens and asks for a helping hand.
Lord, if you could lend a hand down here, there are lots of men who'd really appreciate it.
A large set of breakers comes through, leaving the water momentarily dormant.
Get ready!
Here's their chance.
Wait! Now! Push! Push! Come on!
No! Give it everything! Push!
Keep paddling! Keep bloody paddling!
The 4 Americans, along with Cookie, Leithhead and Brian, push the boat through the surf. They get up some good speed, the boat trailing a wake through the foam. When they are knee-deep in water, the 4 Americans leap aboard and take hold of the paddles from the 4 airmen. The Americans plunge their paddles deep into the water, maintaining the boat's speed as she hits the heavy surf. The first wave stops them in their tracks. The paddlers hold the boat steady. The second wave washes over the bow and the wherry begins to stagger and retreat.
Come on! Give it everything!
Ensign Cook calls out to hang on when the boat surges forward. Backwash running seaward takes the wherry over the last hurdle. Joe McGreevy sees divine intervention.
An invisible hand picked up the stern and shoved the boat and its battling crew into calmer waters.
With the wherry out in the relative safety beyond the surf, Ensign Cook returns to the beach trailing the long lines. He can barely stand. The other Americans are spent. Cook has one last swim in him. Brian divides them into 2 groups and with Cookie's help takes the first group through the surf. The wind skims foam off the top of the sea. The waves are sculpted into unnatural shapes. Once they've made it through the surf, the 2 airmen return to shore while Ensign Cook nurses the 5 men the final strokes to the wherry. Cookie and Brian collapse on the beach, spluttering water and inhaling air. 5 men to go. Brian looks up and sees a 6th man on the beach. His trademark smile bright enough to see in the night. George has returned. Faintly in the hills, torchlights can be seen. The Japanese are nearly on top of them, and with Cookie screaming at him to hurry up, Brian staggers up the beach to the edge of the jungle. He finds the money bag he left under a palm tree and races the bag over to George.
What the bloody hell are you doing? Come on, let's go! They're coming!
Tarima Kasi, George. Tarima Kasi.
George takes the bag and gives Brian a note. It's too dark to read. Brian pulls out his cigarette case and carefully folds it next to the surrender letter he had stored inside. He shakes George's hand, bids him farewell and enters the surf, the last airman to escape Timor. Brian makes it to the break line, wave after wave slapping him under, his strength forsaking him at last. His hand loses the long line and he's tumbled around. He's lost his bearings. The fight drains out of him. At the last moment, Brian feels a strong arm reach under his stomach and pull him back up to the surface. Cookie and Brian pull themselves along the line. They make it beyond the surf and are hauled into the wherry. Once all are aboard, the Americans plunge their oars into the sea. Slowly, they draw away from Timor. Brian lifts his head above the gunwales. He sees the lights of the Japanese moments from the beach. George is nowhere to be seen. Brian turns back to the sea. Eventually, the water steadies as they move into Searaven's lee. The men are brought onto the ship, with Phil Keane laid unconscious on the deck while the others are lowered down the hatch.
All but 2 of the airmen had to be carried below on the shoulders of our men.
Brian and Cookie walk down the ladder on their own steam. Before lowering himself through the hatch, Brian takes a last look at Timor. It's an island he will not be able to forget, the resting place for 4 men under his command, and the place he believed would be his own tomb.
Stow the wherry. Gun crew, secure the deck gun. All hands.
The wherry is hoisted on deck and stowed inside the superstructure. In all the excitement, nobody notices that Phil Keane has been left on the deck of the submarine.
All ahead, full. Clear the bridge. Prepare to dive.
The klaxon sounds, indicating the submarine is diving. Phil Keane comes to his senses. He hears the rushing of water and feels the wind whipping across him. But everyone is gone. Dread and terror rush through his body, giving him one last boost of energy. With all his strength, he calls for help.
Help! Help!
The last sailor steps into the after battery and prepares to close the hatch when he hears a voice. It's so soft, the wind nearly sweeps it away.
Hey mate, what about me?
It's Phil Keane's first coherent sentence in a week, and it saves his life. Willing hands are summoned topside and Phil is lowered into the submarine. With the boat secure, Cassidy heads for the mess to find the leader of the rescued party. Brian's face is buried in a bowl of tomato soup while his hands tear apart a piece of bread. Cassidy invites him to finish up his meal in his stateroom.
Captain, I can't thank you enough.
He points Brian to a seat, unlocks a cabinet, and pulls out a bottle and 2 glasses.
I don't think we'd have made it to sunrise. The boys on the sub were marvellous.
Technically, the United
Although the
States
Navy is dry, it was necessary to crack a few bottles of scotch
We use this
for medicinal purposes.
only.
Sometime that night, Brian remembers the note George had handed him. He pulls out the cigarette case. Water has seeped in, but the letter is only damp at the edges. George's note is torn down the middle. It's a note of currency. On the face of it, written in Dutch, it says, "The Japanese government pays 1 guilder to the bearer." In Brian's view, there's only one way George could have possibly got this note of currency. He'd intercepted the Japanese patrol, and under the pretense of helping them locate the Australians, was rewarded money for services rendered. In fact, George had thrown them off the scent. He'd then returned to see the airmen off. It was an act of bravery that every member of the rear party would never forget.
The Americans saved us, but it was George who kept us alive.
April the 20th, and Searaven is heading for Fremantle, Western Australia. With Darwin still subject to raids, Fremantle is deemed a safer port, but the new destination will add 5 days to Searaven's journey. Cassidy worries that many of those Australians won't make it.
All suffering from malaria and tropical fevers. 3 unconscious and in serious condition. Many tropical ulcers, 1 serious. 12 bed patients. All require hospitalization.
As for the others, they gorge on dark chocolate, bread, scrambled eggs and poached eggs, coffee, tinned fruit, hot cocoa, cake, beef stew, soup and American jello.
They killed us with kindness and all rich food. We got some hot soup, but there's all sorts of stuff which didn't suit our caved-in stomachs. I'd lost half my body weight. I was 14 stone, I went down to 7. Some were even worse than that. The ants killed us with kindness, we do.
Nobody considers the ramifications of unrestrained eating after 2 months of severe rationing. Men keel over and vomit. The sailors hand over their spare clothes and give up hammocks, offer up their decks of cards and reading material, and lend an ear to the airman's story.
Those Aussies were grand. They'd been through hell for weeks. They were as weak as babes. Those who could stand up promptly asked if they could do anything to lend a hand. Seemed kind of disappointed when we told them everything was okay.
For the airmen, it all seems like heaven after the hell of the last 2 months. Their constant terror and fear is finally lifting. The sickest men are even starting to show signs of improvement. But there's one last obstacle to overcome. 2 days out from Fremantle, a fire in the manoeuvring room cripples the submarine.
Bring up the foam!
An Australian ship, the HMAS Maryborough, tows her the rest of the way with a Catalina flying boat providing air cover and the American destroyers USS Parrott and USS Paul Jones providing a screen. Searaven and her escorts finally enter the port of Fremantle at first light on April the 26th, 1942, 6 days after leaving Timorese waters. A small gathering of senior US Navy officers, RAF officers and ambulance officers waits on the docks. All the Australians are kept below decks, but for one. Standing on deck, flanked either side by Lieutenant Commander Hiram Cassidy and Ensign George Cook, is a dishevelled-looking man in a United States naval officer's coat. My grandfather, Brian Rofe, is accorded the honour of being the only passenger permitted on deck as the submarine heads into port. Underneath his beard, Brian surely permitted himself a smile. He'd brought his men home. But they were not out of danger yet. The extent of each man's physical deterioration was only properly assessed once they were admitted to Perth's Hollywood Hospital. Every man was diagnosed with malaria and prescribed huge doses of quinine. All had lost a huge amount of weight, none more so than Phil Keane, who weighed 92 kilograms at the beginning of the ordeal and 38 kilograms by the end. In his report, Brian commended Phil for his fighting spirit, his refusal to surrender to his illness. He named 10 others for their courage, stamina and selfless contribution, but he saved his highest praise for Flying Officer Arthur Cole, recommending him for honours for the faithful service he gave the commanding officer. It was on this recommendation that Arthur received an MBE. Brian also mentioned Flight Lieutenant Harold Cook in his report for helping the sick and enfeebled men through the surf on the last night of the evacuation and effectively saving their lives. Although Cookie didn't receive any honours for his part in the rescue, he would ultimately be appointed as commanding officer of No. 33 Squadron, which was based out of Port Moresby, and where he would be cited in official reports for somewhat different reasons. Using 33 Squadron's aircraft and supplies, Cookie ran cigarettes and whiskey from New Guinea to Australia, making approximately £1 per carton and anything from £5 to £10 per bottle. It was one of the biggest rackets of the Pacific War. Eventually he was caught and court-martialed, the whole affair making national headlines. The trial was a major embarrassment for the Air Force, and to end the spectacle, Cookie was coaxed into a deal. He could keep the profits of his illegal enterprise provided he confessed to all charges and accepted a 12-month prison sentence, after which he'd be cashiered out of the military. Cookie took the deal. In a private letter to my grandfather, Cookie fessed up to pocketing £40,000, a figure equivalent to roughly $2 million today. Despite his unscrupulous character, Cookie never forgot a friend. He ran an effective public relations campaign many years after the war and raised money for some Timorese villagers who suffered at the hands of the Japanese for helping the stranded Australian airmen. Brian also singled out Corporal Ron Bell in his report, the party's senior wireless electrical mechanic. All members of the rescued party were in agreement that Ron's technical prowess and skill in radio ensured their survival, but Ron was overlooked for decoration. He would receive public recognition in a different walk of life. After the war, Ron's love of radio was overtaken by an even keener obsession for horticulture, specifically breeding roses. Ron was awarded an OAM for the breeding and cultivation of roses and won the prestigious Queen Mother's International Award for rose breeding. Ron was one of 5 surviving airmen I met in my research before they died. All 5 had led full lives. They'd all married, raised children, worked hard, and after the ordeal they endured on Timor, treated every day as a blessing. Like all the members of the rescued rear party, they were ordinary men caught up in extraordinary circumstances. But when you consider the unseen wounds that they all bore, their optimism and zeal for life made them remarkable. Len Burke told me at the end of my last interview with him that hardly a day goes by when I don't think about something that happened on Timor. Len also told me something about Brian Rofe that I'd heard in other interviews with those men. He told me that despite finding himself out of Brian's favour on more than one occasion and feeling the full force of Brian's temper, he would sometimes think, who would have made a better leader? And there was no one else besides Brian.
Who would have made a better leader? There was no one.
My grandfather would be awarded an MBE for commanding the RAF rear party on Timor and leading them to safety. Brian and Arthur Cole's awards were reported in the press in October 1942. Information was limited to each man's citation. Details relating to the rescue were censored, and for good reason. The Searaven mission was proof that the rescue of displaced soldiers trapped on Japanese-held islands could be effected by submarine. Allied intelligence was determined to keep the revelations secret from the Japanese so as not to endanger future missions. By the time the gagging order in the Australian press was lifted in February 1944, the papers were full of morale-boosting reports of Japanese reversals. The story had become indistinguishable from countless other tales of bravery and courage that were emerging out of the bloodiest conflict in human history. It was a slightly different story in America, where the rescue was given a 2-page spread in the popular Saturday Evening Post. The report focused on the crew of the Searaven and celebrated the heroism of George Cook and Hiram Cassidy, who both received the Navy Cross, the American military's second highest decoration awarded for valour in combat. In 1957, the story was featured in The Silent Service, a popular television series which dramatised actual submarine stories of the war. The show was hosted by Rear Admiral Thomas M. Dykers, retired. Here he is introducing the Searaven story.
In the spring of 1942, the USS Searaven went through one of the most thrilling episodes of the war.
The show was wildly inaccurate and very much of its time, but it did feature a short interview with George Cook.
On the shoulders of a young ensign. We are fortunate to have with us the hero of our story, Ensign George C. Cook, who is now Commander Cook, United States Navy. George, when you volunteered for submarines, you probably had no idea you'd go through one of your most hair-raising experiences ashore.
That's right, sir, and especially on an island as remote as Timor.
You must be quite a swimmer to have made those trips through the surf, particularly carrying a man on your back.
Well, I was brought up on the shores of Massachusetts and been swimming practically all my life in the surf.
How did it feel to have all those strange people scatter for the jungle when you turned the light on your face?
Even before I turned the flashlight out, it was one of life's darkest moments.
You were decorated with the Navy Cross for this action, and you certainly deserved it. Congratulations to you.
And then the story disappeared from public view. But those who lived through the ordeal would never forget, even if at times forgetting was exactly what they wanted. My grandfather would quickly discover that he would never truly escape the horrors he endured on Timor. It happened a month after his return to Australia. Brian had spent 2 weeks recovering in hospital before marrying his beloved Patricia Whitford in Adelaide. The newlyweds then travelled to Melbourne for their honeymoon. Shortly after checking into their hotel, Brian was back in Timor. As my grandmother recalled in her memoirs, we were about to go out for a meal
and he began to shiver violently. The riggers persisted, me panicking. He said, "Just leave me alone." But then came extraordinary sweating. All the towels came into action. And then the horrors experienced back in Timor's jungle, swearing at the poor fellows who were slowing up and shouting encouragement to all and sundry. The language was awful, and I was terrified we'd be asked to leave.
The malarial attacks would plague Brian for the rest of his life, as they would plague all the airmen. At the cessation of hostilities, Brian was sent back to Timor. He organised the repatriation of the remains of Private Clem Clements, Corporal Roy Andrews, aircraftman Jim Graham, and Pilot Officer Peter Thompson. Brian also served as the RAF representative during Japan's formal surrender of Timor at Penfoe Aerodrome. After the ceremony, he took a stroll through the operations hut, mess and barracks that had been his home for 5 months. It was mostly destroyed, but inside the operations hut, he found a white parachute stuffed into the bottom drawer of a desk. It made him think of the day of invasion, when he and his men were very nearly caught on the wrong side of the paratroop drop. This parachute belonged to a soldier who served under Lieutenant Yamabe Masao. Yamabe had continued his violent reign of terror in Dutch Timor after Brian and his men escaped. He was accused of leading 6 separate group executions of captured Allied servicemen, Dutch nationals and missionaries throughout Timor and Ambon. Separately, Yamabe was implicated in the execution of Sergeants Bert Hurl and Doug Witham, the air gunners aboard Cookie's doomed Hudson. Yamabe also murdered at least 4 Timorese men in reprisal for helping the Australian airmen escape. The number of Timorese Yamabe killed was almost certainly higher, and they are among the estimated 50,000 men, women and children killed during the Japanese occupation of the island of Timor. Constantly drunk on sake and increasingly despondent on hearing news of Japanese reversals, Yamabe volunteered to leap from a plane above an Allied munitions dump with a bomb strapped to his chest. That mission was aborted, and despite his efforts to die for the Empire, Yamabe survived the war. He returned to Japan and managed to evade capture from Allied soldiers investigating Japanese atrocities and re-emerged once the trials of accused war criminals concluded. He married, had 3 children and wrote a book about his military service called Navy Paratroopers, where he airbrushed the atrocities that came to define his war. Yamabe Masao, the soldier whose keen military mind gave rise to Japan's first light airborne infantry unit and who would become a notorious war criminal, died a penniless alcoholic. Back in the operations hut, Brian took the parachute out of the drawer and decided to send it home. The package never arrived, and just as well, that parachute was stained with the blood of innocent lives. Before he left Timor, Brian penned a letter to his wife.
Darling Patricia, I have no stake in Timor and have now bid it farewell. But I guess there will always be a certain nostalgia whenever I think of it. Once I leave these tropics, I'm more likely to take up residence at the Antarctic because I could think of nothing nicer than an icy night, a butte double bed, and you.
Shortly before departing Timor, Brian was approached by a man in a white sarong with neatly combed hair. It was Sahatian, the missionary of Mosul, that Brian and the airmen met in the first week of their entrapment.
He told me that George is all right. I feel so relieved and happy that our one and only George is safe.
After the war, Brian took up a job at the Bureau of Meteorology before joining a defence laboratory. In 1954, he was placed in charge of a group responsible for all rocket and missile trials at the Woomera Rocket Range in outback South Australia. This included overseeing the build and launch of Australia's first successfully launched satellite, RESAT-1. Brian would go on to accept the prestigious post of Director of the Australian Antarctic Division. In the summer of 1970-71, he accompanied an expedition to Mawson and Davis stations. It was the only time he would ever see the White Continent. Brian was diagnosed with bowel cancer on returning to Australia and would die 5 months later. He was 53. I never met my grandfather. He died before I was born. What I knew of him was largely pieced together from stories told to me by my grandmother, Patty. In her mind, what happened to Brian on Timor made him the leader who he would become. But the ordeal led to untold suffering that Brian endured until his last breath. My grandmother always said,
"The man for whom I fell in love was not the man who came back from Timor."
But her love for my grandfather never waned. Despite many eligible suitors that courted her after his death, she would never marry again for one simple reason.
I never met a man like Brian Rove.
Before she died, aged 92 in 2010, my grandmother told me that days before Brian died, someone knocked on the front door of their house. My grandmother opened it.
I knew you would come.
Standing before her was a man entering old age who had retained a powerful build and a glint in his eye. It was the look of a rogue. The man put a finger to his lips, silencing my grandmother before she could greet him, and walked into the hallway. He stopped, cupped his hands around his mouth, and bellowed into the gloomy silence. For the first time in weeks, laughter came from my grandfather's room. Right at the very end, just when he was needed most, the old man had come again.
Cookie! Get in here! You better have not come here empty-handed.
Cookie smuggled a bottle of brandy into Brian's bedroom. Brian took his brandy neat and toasted the good fortune he had enjoyed in his life, never pining on regrets. And one last time, as the sun set on his life, my grandfather talked about Timor. Trapped was written and produced by Tom Trumbull with Sam Loy, James Milsom and Ryan Pemberton for the Australian War Memorial. Special thanks to my voice actors, Sam Loy, James Milsom, David Pruden, Davey Wallace, Tim Duncan, Ben Rigetti, Andrew Wu, Zane Ellenwood, Adam Dunning, Ken Zoe, John Colley, Jacob Phillip, Doug Elan, Hannah Moore and John O'Burns, who voiced the part of my grandfather.